Ooh, recording in progress. Sweet. All right. How you doing,
Oh,
man?
I'm doing good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm beat up.
Yeah. That's what working life will do. And
Yeah, it's especially working for a labor union for some reason. They just really love to have bad labor practices, but here we are. And that's
yeah,
why we're here to talk about Karl Marx.
and it's important that you said that because, when people engage with socialist politics in general now, things like trade unions are seen as kind of like the end,
Hmm.
right? We
Hmm.
will end in this space where there are like trade unions and collective bargaining and like a meaningful living wage, and society will be better. Maybe there will be a progressive tax, and then we can just get to the work of human rights or something like that. But as we will see today, we are taking an excursion from Capital to go over Marx's earlier text, published in 1848, um, the Manifesto for Communism, or the Communist Manifesto. What is the official title of it? I believe it is a Manifesto of the Communist Party, and then also called the Communist Manifesto. So it's a short book, 4 chapters.
Yeah, I think it's where a lot of us get our start. I mean, compared to the most of the stuff we read, this is you can read this in an afternoon, or
Mm-hmm.
an hour even maybe. But I don't think that should hurt its veracity. I mean, whereas something like Capital that we're reading now is, a book full of theory. It's well researched. Karl Marx. I almost just called him Carl, like I know him.
Oh
Uh,
God.
but Carl is like, he's basically trying to turn his theories into a science. He wants that kind of, um, for there not to be a doubt and for him to be taken seriously. Where the Communist Manifesto is fun in some ways because it is written to be more of a call to arms. Famously in Leninist and Stalinist Russia, people weren't expected to necessarily have read all the theory, but the Communist Manifesto was something that you were kind of expected to have read and to know about. Um, and I think this goes with its history too, right? Like, so you mentioned that it was published in 1848, February, I think, 21st, 1848, one day before the Paris Revolution happened.
Yes.
Although we shouldn't make any kind of connection there because Communist Manifesto was published in England, and things did not travel that quickly back in the day.
Mm.
But it's written at a period where revolution was in the air. Engels and Marx were asked to write this. They were a part of a group called the Communist League, that was mainly a lot of German emigres, although there were also some people who had been part of the 1839 coup in Paris. And this came out of, other revolutionary groups, League of the Just. But the point being is that Karl Marx was basically asked to write a program of what it was to be a communist. And that's what this is.
Yes, absolutely. And so when what we got into in the first episode on Capital, largely concerned sort of granular details about production, about commodities, about their circulation, about the invention of money, which comes out of a very specific lineage of thought, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So in both England and France, you have um, mutual growths of liberal thought, mutual and diverging growths of liberal thought that lead to thinkers like David Ricardo and Adam Smith, which were influences on earlier socialist thinkers, as we will get into a bit later. And so um, at this time in the late 40s, Marx is already doing his theoretical work, but he's coming out of it as an activist, as a journalist, and as a younger reader of philosophy. He was earlier part of the Young Hegelians, right? And in this, you see when he talks about antagonisms, when he talks about, I think at some points, contradictions, right? Um, the kind of early forms of what is fully realized in Capital. But you also see things that Capital doesn't do so much, which is, as you described really well, Egon, the kind of polemic character of the text. And that was because in 1848, you have an incredible explosion of revolution across Europe that had been building for some years, right? In 1830, you have the revolution of the Orleanists, the July Revolution in France, which puts Louis Philippe in the seat of power and
Back to the
led to,
throne.
yes, and sitting in the throne was what he was known as, the petty bourgeois king. He considered him a small businessman who had become the richest man in France. And then
You think someone
simultaneously,
would have a hip hop name like that by now? Betty
petty
Bourgeois
bourgeois,
King, baby.
yeah.
Um,
And then also in Germany, you have an extreme amount of work going into a furtive and powerful socialist movement. And then in conversely to that, in 1832, England sets up the parliamentary system. And so England, which was the opposition of the Bonapartists in the Napoleonic War, they kind of both represent the conservative status quo, but also were able to realize earlier than some of these more radical states, France coming out of the French Revolution, and Germany, and Prussia, this group of states and even unrelated states like Poland that were pulled in, that had more political activity, were beaten to kind of parliamentary and representative politics by the English. And so this all leads to a kind of explosion of what Marx defines as the proletariat. But we'll get there.
yeah, and I think it's important to set the historical like precedent for something like the Communist Manifesto because it's so like of its time and place, I think, in a lot of ways. And because it is such a, it's a manifesto, you can pick it up, you can read it in an afternoon. It's easy to just enjoy it and sort of miss these things, right? Like you mentioned that Karl Marx was kind of blossoming into the thinker he was becoming out of both journalism and activism. He meets Engels in 1844 or something like this. This is also when he writes his economic manuscripts that sort of are kind of the bud that blossoms into the Communist Manifesto, into a lot of his work that is, kind of what we know him today. But at the same time, like it was discovered posthumously, he wrote a critique of German idealism in the late 1830s. And basically, this is a long way of saying you've got, to bring it back to the young Hegelians, right? You basically had Hegel, who in Phenomenology of Spirit is like, we have reached the culmination of history, and that was seen in the Prussian Reich and in the kind of enlightened monarchy there, but also seen through kind of what was happening with the Jacobins and the French Revolution.
Absolutely.
But the reason there's a young Hegelians, there's kind of the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians, and there was sort of the old guard who saw like the Prussian monarchy as the culmination of history. But especially out of the French Revolution, you had this movement of Karl Marx, Blanqui, much later on Proudhon, but he comes from this lineage.
Ferdinand Lassalle, who was another like major participant in all of this and an interlocutor of Marx with very different types of thoughts,
right,
as well.
Armand Barbet. But you've got these fellows who are like realizing that the Jacobin Revolution didn't go far enough. But the as he starts the Communist Manifesto, the specter is there.
Mm-hmm.
And he's writing this at a time where he kind of jokes in the beginning of the Communist Manifesto that pretty much any establishmentary government or ruler is calling their opponents communists or socialists, even if they aren't, and that it's this specter haunting Europe. And he's writing it in a time where this was very real. I mean, we talk about this stuff, I think, far more theoretically than they were.
Yes, absolutely. And it's quite fascinating how now we're kind of after the Cold War and after kind of like the neoliberal bourgeois regression, and we'll get into the beginning of the book, which is about what does it mean to be bourgeoisie, right? There is this return to that specter, but it lacks the kind of legitimacy of a material movement where people are out in the streets, where people are willing to overturn their governments, where people are willing to take certain risks of life, that that freedom or death, the death part, right? In realizing something that is beyond the present. And it's difficult to understand because I think through American teaching, all of Marx is filtered through Stalinism, right? Is filtered through his statist interpretation of Marxist Leninism and the idea of a vanguard party, occupying the Russian state or the USSR and leading worldwide communism. That, for as Marx states explicitly, communism isn't like this single thing, though it is a single thing. It is an aid to, a reinforcement of, and a projection of all of the workers' parties and workers' movements around the world. And this could be from America to France. We're primarily talking about Europe and France at the time because of this first idea of the bourgeoisie. So maybe we should get into that so that we can start laying.
Yeah. I think that's great because, and I think it's important to note Marx says about writing the Communist Manifesto, it is not against any left party. It is just stating an international aim. I mean, it is really this kind of the start of this internationalism, because, I think he was right in seeing that it would take an international movement to accomplish these things. And the social upheaval was already there. Just to mention the revolutions of 1848, when this was published, you had a revolution of Palermo right before the book was published. Day after, Paris. In March, you had Baden, you had Munich, you had Vienna, you had Hungary, you had Berlin, you had Milan, you had Poland, you had Venice. In April, you had Moldavia and Dresden. May, Transylvania. And then over the year, I mean, most of the revolutions lasted at most 6 months. They weren't incredibly successful, although there were 6 abdications of sitting, monarchs. So it was successful in some sense, but, it's like, there was something manifest about what was going on, and that's why this is so charged. But I think you're right. Let's start with the actual work itself, and separating out, as he does, what is the bourgeoisie, what is the proletariat.
Yeah, and I think, and just to affirm what you're talking about, I think many of the points within will lead back to that historical context. So clearly Marx is trying to differentiate something as new, right? And he goes at lengths to define the bourgeoisie, right? It is a new class that comes out of conflict with feudal monarchies, right? So the bourgeoisie has certain characteristics, right? Obviously, there is what it is not. It is not the aristocracy, right? It comes out of feudal systems as the sort of business class that had that you know created business, created trade, and that was subordinated often within various monarchic states. But as this class grows within it, they begin to demand some universal rights. And in this respect, they become revolutionary because they are trying to destroy this previous epoch, as Marx would define it. So rather than seeing history as like this one long continuity, he is subdividing historical moments based on the character of power and the character of the way that states ruled over their people and the way that that ruling determined how people were classified, right? And so, oh, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to add that yeah, I mean what he identified the bourgeoisie, right, as coming out of the merchant class, right,
Mhm.
who through feudalism began to have more and more power as they were able to amass more and more wealth. And then as we're seeing, in capital that we're actively going through right now, is that through the Industrial Revolution, we had the bourgeois revolution as well as this technological revolution
Yes.
that made the accumulation of capital possible, right? And so you've got kind of multiple things happening at once where you've got this urban class becoming that is taking the place of the aristocracy. It's no longer, oh, well, my family has owned this land and all the tithes with it from time immemorial, but rather, this merchant class that has developed wealth and developed power and is using that now to both become the ruling class as well as create the the proletariat, which is, anyone who is forced to sell their time, that basically sell their labor for a
Yeah.
wage and commodify themselves. And so
Yes.
he's like,
Oh,
I was
sorry.
just going to say, he's identifying this like historical moment where, feudalism has died, has passed. And with it is not only do we have a new ruling class, but we have a new lower class as well, which he calls the proletariat, which is, shouldn't be confused with, you know, um, uh, uh,
Like the feudal peasantry
there we go,
before it.
peasantry. Thank you.
Yes.
I was like, it's
Uh,
another P word.
exactly. And there's, as you were listing the kind of qualitative changes that the bourgeoisie gained throughout, one that you suggested and which becomes central is their property. That these monarchies, these aristocratic lines, they controlled property, and therefore in the feudal system were able to have peasants living on their land, working sometimes for free, sometimes for the right to have a space and have food, etc. And so with the bourgeoisie, now they're transforming the way that society functions. They're rapidly urbanizing society, as he defines. They're making society more cosmopolitan, right? So
Mhm.
with that urbanization, you start seeing these new cultural facets, new artistic forms. This isn't stated explicitly, but this is part of cosmopolitanism. And also they have another side, which is this centering of law on jurisprudence, right? on these concepts of sort of eternal truths, things like justice. And so these elements are just now, and it's interesting because the feudal period is so long,
Hmm.
but the bourgeois period, the movement from this period of the bourgeois to the question of the proletariat gaining power, right, is actually quite short, right? We're talking a
Incredibly
couple
short.
100 years.
And marked by this insane turmoil too, right? I mean, it kind of starts with like the English Civil War. You've got the French and American revolutions, um, but these weren't as political as we want to believe them to be. I think they're much more indicative of this social change, right? And you mentioned this with this all of a sudden turning to jurisprudence, right? This kind of Enlightenment turn where it's not that, oh well, our king is been named by God and so he must be
Mm-hmm.
right, but turns to this more liberal idea of justice and fairness, and and I'm sort of throwing quotes around these words, but also sort of not. I mean, they meant what they said, that
Yes.
and these ideas of liberty, right, that kind of haunt America to this day.
and
But
and and I would say, like, in the previous thinkers that we have approached, Kant and Hegel, they're kind of the end for Marx, in a sense, of like the philosophical edifice of the bourgeois,
hmm
right?
hmm
Because there were previous thinkers. You can go back to Hume and Locke, Hobbes, as English representatives, and later, or and concurrently, people like Rousseau and Diderot in France, who were part of the French Revolution, who are articulating these ideas. But by the time that it's reaching um, Marx's younger years, there is a sort of naturalization of these ideas, despite what is happening on the ground, which is an enormous amount of inequality. So I find there to be a great quote in the uh, section on the bourgeoisie, where uh, Marx says, a similar movement is going on before our eyes. And here he's talking about the movement of the bourgeois class. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up a gigantic means of production and exchange, is like a sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. And so he is both recognizing the immense revolutionary power of industrialization, of the technology that is produced, of the ability of markets to like connect and develop the world with such rapidity and such transformation. But at the same time, he is also recognizing that these powers have extended outside, and this is sort of a precursor to what we talked about as alienation in the capital episode. But these massive forces of the markets and of the bourgeois class have left their control, and what is left in its wake are these proletarian workers, right? Are these people who are propping up the bourgeois business, the bourgeois industry.
producing, as he says in the same section, their own grave diggers,
Yes.
which I really like. Where and it's kind of an interesting nod to Hegel too, and the sort of reference to the underworld and
Mm-hmm.
the underground, and of course this idea that in this sort of uncontrolled process of capitalization, that they are also creating this class, the proletariat, um, whom he describes as being an arm of the machine, right? What does he say? Uh, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. And through this sort of dehumanization is creating this class that has no choice but to rise up and revolt against the bourgeois and the chains that they build themselves.
And what's really fascinating about it is that though this happens almost immediately out of it, you know, there isn't this threat of the same threat of monarchic control, of aristocratic control, though it still exists and is what is being fought for the year that this is released. For the proletariat, he describes them as being relatively ungrounded, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is work to be done for the proletariat to reach the conditions where they can revolt against the bourgeoisie, right? Like the bourgeoisie had to develop over hundreds of years so that they could not only have the means, as in like property, value, money, weaponry, etc., but also just the ideas and the understanding of what is going on. So it's not enough to just be a worker and with other workers and say, I don't like what's going on. But here he is defining like what is needed, what must be thought, what must be removed and replaced
Mm-hmm.
for the proletariat to succeed. Simultaneously, though, he is resistant to the idea that an individual socialist thinker in the mold of these earlier idealist philosophers, empirical philosophers, and other thinkers of economy and natural philosophy, that their singular idea can be the prescription for something that comes out of material concerns, material conflicts, and instead that the solutions are determined by the struggle.
Right, and and then so as he goes into the next section, the proletariat or communism and proletariat, whichever way he orders it, I think that's one of the important things he observes is that this power of the bourgeois, of the bourgeoisie, of capital, is a social power, right? This isn't a king ordained by God or a conqueror or some individualistic power, but that social power can only be met by another social power, right?
Yes.
And so this is kind of a big part of it, right? Is that like um actually some part of argument amongst Marx and some of his contemporaries where it's like, well, do we need to, you know, essentially seed the proletariat with these ideas, or should we seek revolution now? And obviously, as we talk about the revolutions of 1848, etc., like these things were actively happening, but there is this transition where from we mostly think of epochs changing through these different cultures or something that come to power, and he's arguing for something different, right? And that's a social power to be fought, not an individualistic power, not a even a cultural power, because he's arguing that the act of industrialization actually rips the proletariat of all their identifying marks that makes national identity matter, because it starts to cease to matter, because the differences that separated the German tradesman from the French one begin to evaporate in a bourgeois society.
And in fact, that individualism and that notion of the state as centering kind of human thought, human organization, and society, right? These are naturalizations of the bourgeois class itself, of the bourgeoisie. So there's going to naturally be an antagonism within the proletariat that comes up through this bourgeois society, wherein they are an individual, but they do not actually have these rights as an individual. What is being fought for at this moment is universal suffrage, the right for everyone to vote, right? The commune of women, right? And this is a very important part for Marx, because, like, for instance, he talks about dissolving the family, right? But what he's also pointing out is that the family within bourgeois society has been turned into a relationship of money, right? Money is passed down to your son, and you contain your power over your property through your family. And at the lower classes, and I think this should resonate very well now, is not even a right of the proletariat. We can look at this today when you hear right wingers and even your Booker T. Washingtonian liberals talk about the problem of the black family or something like that. Fathers not being in homes, right? It isn't an accident that this happens, but rather that without those moneyed interests, without this industrial relation, the family has ceased to have meaning, because it doesn't do what it did in feudalism, and it isn't allowed to do what it can within bourgeois society. So, as Marx suggests, when the woman is no longer a property, right, for the man of the house who is the capitalist, then what is necessary is a community of women acting of their own devices, working towards their own betterment. And
Well,
that
yeah, it
this is
was like
something. Oh, sorry.
it came up and I think this was like hardly even research, but it's just a radio program I was listening to where, because of industrialization, of course, women are forced to work. And we could go into the long history of women working, because it's, they were always part of the quote unquote workforce in feudal times, et cetera. But really, it's almost a bourgeois conception that a woman would stay at home with the family. But for the
Yes.
proletariat, where you're working 12-hour days in a factory, childcare and working become really difficult things to navigate, right? And so there was a baby formula that had opium in it. And so that way you could feed your children
Mm-hmm.
before you went to work, and they would basically be comatose for like 12 hours. And then you'd go home and feed it to them again, because you're being asked to do all of these things. And so this kind of
Yeah.
community of women was especially important for Marx, because it is fundamental to breaking that system, right? That bourgeois system of patriarchal dependence, of extending that patriarchal oppression. Um, so that was super important. And it's funny, at the end of this
And
section, he says, the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to establish democracy. So, like, there's your first point, right? Like, we associate democracy and communism as these things in fraught with one another, fighting against each other. But
yeah.
in the original conception, that's not totally true. And then
Yes. No. There are clear demands that he gets into, and
Mhm.
it's very interesting that when he talks about abolition of things, he uses the word Aufhebung, right? Like he's talking about overcoming. He's using a Hegelian term, and we talked about the family and conception in Hegel, and it's something that's repeated here. There, in addition to these kind of epochal shifts, right? There are going to be demands, right, that are going to come into contradiction with what is the ultimate end of the movement. And I think it's quite clearly defined at the end of this section on the proletariat. What are the sort of rough things that we must go through before we can reach communism or this
Mhm.
proletarian state?
So yeah, you know, he's kind of beginning to lay out what he thinks is the program for this movement of social power from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. And I think one of the interesting things about the Communist Manifesto, ooh, excuse me, tacos, Taco Tuesday. But one of the most interesting things in the Communist Manifesto, as far as all of Marx's works is concerned, is that he's actually very clear in laying out what he thinks needs to happen. And as I mentioned, he says the first step is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, to establish democracy, to, you know, essentially give power to the proletariat by a kind of public decree. And then he follows that and says that in doing so would centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. So in this democratic state run by the proletariat. And at the end of this section 2, he gives us 10 things that will generally be applicable to this process. Number 1, he says the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. So the abolition of property as a private held entity, and by default, no one can pay rent for land. So it's in some ways the return of the commons, but I think beyond that, because it's not an indentured servitude, but viewing land as a public good, right?
Yeah, and there's a very interesting moment that he has. I'm not sure if I can find it immediately, but I can give a rough paraphrasing where he talks about the kind of fear of the bourgeoisie and their complaints about these demands, and he talks about them. They're like, "Oh, would you take the land of like an artisan or like a commoner?" And he's like, "These forms do not need to be taken because they are not part of what I'm talking about. But also, they're also already disappearing under the bourgeois epoch, right? They're
Right. It's like a
under these
moot
forces,
argument, right?
and so
Like
it's entirely moot.
the
So, like
artisan
when
can't
we
pay rent because, you know, or it doesn't have
or
his
own
like
property, yeah,
ancestral,
there
yeah.
isn't the artisan sitting in their little cottage making to use our last week's example, violins, right? Like this is something that is disappearing. The violin is being produced in a factory by hundreds of workers who are now working for a boss, right? So when he's talking about grasping this property, he's talking about grasping it from major property owners who have privatized it so that the workers who are participating in production and all of the people who are living in the world who cannot access that will be able to in some way through this democratic process, but also through direct control be able to derive some value from that.
Right. It's like the common misconception of communism, right? It's like, oh, you're going to kick me off my land? And it's like, no, we're trying to cease the commodification of you needing a structure to live in. You know, it's just like
Yes.
the commodification of our labor time, right? It's like, you know, in even in feudal times, you didn't pay rent. You know,
Yeah.
you may have owed tithes or taxes and things like this. Um, but it was seen as your inheritance in some ways that you lived
Yes.
in this or that hovel
There was a promise
on
that
so and so
people live in
lord's
a
property.
space. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Which leads us into the next one. So he's got after the abolition of property and rents is number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, which is something we're talking about today, right?
Today.
Like,
Yeah. I mean, Bernie Sanders is on the bullhorn yelling for this. Leftists are still yelling for this. And in this regard, I think it's important to really question what people mean when they say someone is radical today, right? Because this is radical in 1848, right?
yeah, yeah,
It has ceased to be radical to ask for those things in the present. And I think that's just something we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about this birth of leftist politics. If we are still asking for a commons for women, if we were still asking for a graduated income tax, like,
I
are
know.
we being radical, or are we simply like going to the basic ideas of the people who saw the original problems of bourgeois society and capitalist society?
Yeah, who saw this whole problem beginning, you know? And he goes a step further too. Number three, abolition of all right of inheritance, right? So, enough of, keeping these inequalities through inheritance, right? Your people are accumulating this massive amount of wealth that they can never possibly spend in their lifetimes, but then passing it down to their progeny so that they are already given a head start
Yes.
and already are provided capital to continue the process. Four,
And
confiscation.
this is certainly, oh, I was just simply going to say, this is one of the ideas that I think really, when someone in the present, even a leftist, hears it, will kind of recoil, because
Mhm.
there's this inherent idea of the meritocracy, and the fact that, oh, your parents earned it and they deserve to pass it down, right? But if we really imagine what would happen, that everyone would have to be reset at zero, and that the value that you gain, you cannot keep it, right?
Well, if you truly believe in a meritocracy, that is a
That would be an
meritocracy,
actual meritocracy.
right?
Yes.
And of
Anyway,
course people cringe because is going to be somebody who is like, well, I've got, even if it's a meager inheritance, I've got something coming to me, and you know and so it does highlight the fact that this stuff does require a certain amount of sacrifice in one way or another from everybody, right? But it's
yes.
for the good of
And in
us
this
all.
regard is, yeah, and in this regard, it's in grave conflict with what I would consider the sort of Anglophone moral systems, where that claim to be meritocracies, like the ideas of John Stuart Mill and like
Mhm, mhm.
utilitarianism, etc., where like uh, there is an idea that, while we're working for the common good, that as individuals, right, we have this sort of inherent right to be self-interested, and that self-sacrifice is sort of against human nature. But in fact, at a time, people work towards that self-sacrifice to develop society, and I think it is possible again, right? So we shouldn't just disregard these, like, oh, that's just not possible. We really need to think about all the ways in which we can destroy the current set of property relations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in the next few we start seeing the sort of foundation for Leninist and kind of Maoist thought and this kind of state communism. The next few are confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels. So if you leave the country, you don't get to keep your money or your value in the country.
Yeah.
And the which leads to the next one, the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank that has an exclusive monopoly on that money. So, I think, again, this is kind of an altruistic look at this, right? That there would be a state run by the proletarian looking out for uh, everyone's interest, right?
Who
Um,
are then all proletarian.
Right. And so we've got further centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Um, which, if you think about this, this is like what everybody always wants, right? Like free public transportation, so people can
Yeah.
get where they need to go without needing to be, better than someone else, right? Um, I use that better than someone else pedantically, right? I don't actually mean
Yes.
that, but like that's how value is given to individuals in a capitalist society, right?
Well, think of the people who live in the suburbs and are able to drive by car on specific highway systems that are never going to be accessed by someone who is limited to a set of buses.
Hmm.
in their local neighborhood within a city, right? And elsewhere, something that plays into this is the dissolution, which isn't in this list, I believe, of um, of urban and the difference between the urban space and the country space. It may be in there, but
Yeah, no, I think it is in here. Yeah, so
okay.
it's
So
actually the
we'll get
next
there.
one, because he talks about extending factories and the means of production to be something that's owned collectively by the excuse, excuse me, those tacos, by the state. But in part of that, oh, he's talking about the improvement of soil.
Yeah, the
Um,
cultivation of wastelands, right?
mhm,
Like
mhm.
and in general, you can see that the idea is that the state, and we must be clear, the state is being balanced by internationalism, and this is something that clearly gets lost in Stalinism and Maoism, and where I think Lenin's vanguardism somewhat obscures, um, is that this state, while working for all people, is in concert with many other groups that are doing the same, and that ideas are being passed for mutual influence, mutual international betterment of people's lives, right? And um, you know, all of these things where the state is taking control, that is not a state that is separated from the democratic body, right? It's not a
Right.
representative
It's
state.
it's not supposed to be an authoritarian state, like kind of how we all envision the state. Um, it's he's really trying to set out ways to eliminate hierarchical, like imposed hierarchies in our social relations, right?
Yeah.
And so this leads to the next one, equal obligation of all to work, right? So, it's like I was going to mention earlier when you were talking about this like production of the bourgeois sort of social structure, in the 1860s is when you get this term called the flaneur, who,
Hmm.
for lack of a better thing to do, dandies about on his strolls, admiring the beauty of the world because he doesn't have to work. And
Or it's
so
suffering.
right, yeah. But this is the idea that we all must contribute in whatever way we can, and so that there aren't these folks who are living off of other people's labor.
Hmm.
And then this is what you were getting at. We've got number 9, combining agriculture with manufacturing industries. So this is kind of the idea of abolishing the distinction between town and country, and trying to find a more equitable distribution of the population. So, and he's kind of responding to Engels' work in Manchester, where with the creation of modern industry and modern cities is the modern slum,
Yes.
and giving people the ability to have space, to have subsistence garden, to you know eliminate the sort of slum as it might be referred to today.
And to return to an earlier point, this abolition again is an overcoming. It's a synthesis, right? In abolishing this distinction between the urban space and the country space by connecting it through a mutually controlled industry, right? You create a continuity of concern and need, right? Because we're all going to be eating that food. We're all
Right.
going to be living off of the structure that is developed in the stead of private industry. And so, now our in America in particular, and many other countries, there are so many political conflicts that are determined by this idea of the rural and the urban, the city dweller and the country dweller, right? And that isn't necessary. That isn't inborn. That is something that is particular of the bourgeois epoch. Now, obviously, cities developed before then. You can go back to the medieval era, and you would find more or less populated places with different cultures. But largely, it was places that were ruled by an aristocrat, and then the peasants that surround them. Now we have two different groups of capitalists who present themselves as radically different, but they are the same. in that they are exploiting the labor of these two different cultures in society, in
Yeah, I mean,
different ways through different means.
he's really speaking about finding the connection between the farmer and the factory worker, and
Absolutely.
eliminating that distinction, um
And
that especially existed in this time where it's like the factory worker, this is a modern, very new thing. And, farming is as old as society is basically. Um, but identifying that this is not a real distinction. If you're part of the proletariat, you're part of the proletariat, whether you live in the country or whether you live in the city. You're still being exploited by the same means and by the same process.
quite functionally, even today, uh, laws around labor that have given rights to the factory workers, to workers in all industries, are often taken from agricultural workers.
Hmm.
That's the reason why we can have 14-year-old Mexican migrants working on these farms, because somehow the bourgeoisie has created a little space. Yeah, they say it's for the person working the small farm, the petty bourgeois, a farm owner who wants their child to work there, even though that is still a money relation itself. But instead, it's farm workers, and this is what Chavez and Huerta fought against, um, are treated as like a very specific and isolated class, and are stripped of certain proletarian values, the ability to unionize in the same way, the same protections of age, the same level of pay, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, even just the basic ones of minimum, their labor is actually worth less. And so this is, kind of what compels the bourgeois ruling class to make sure that they lean into these sort of racist distinctions between immigration, right? Because it's a legalized, another form of legalized exploitation. And especially living out in California, you hear about it all the time where it's like, these factory farms couldn't run without this insanely criminally cheap labor, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then the very last one of his 10 points is free education for all children in public schools. Think about that.
Yeah, and the abolition of factory labor, right? Which,
Yeah,
yeah,
which
we
goes
have.
along with that children shouldn't be forced into wage labor.
Yeah, and we have absolved, not absolved. We have abolished a lot of it, but certainly in, while I don't agree with everything he says, Chris Catrona has a quote that I've always remembered, which is, that the only thing worse than being exploited by capitalism is to not be exploited by capitalism, which kind of hits on this distinction between the bourgeois and then what it is that exists outside of it, right? The necessity of states to even reach this bourgeois phase to start this proletarian battle, and why places like Vietnam and Bolivia and these states don't, their forms of socialism are not exactly the same thing as what Marx is talking about, because they have not done so. And so around the world we do have child labor, and then even in the states we have child labor under specific conditions that help support the ruling class and their monopolies on production.
Well, and I'll just use this quote that's actually about kind of reformism and bourgeois socialism, but I think it sums up what you're getting at very well, where he says the bourgeois are bourgeois for the benefit of the working class, and
Yes,
that they always use their advantages and that their high-minded liberalism for the benefit of the working class, but of course for the benefit of the status quo of the working class, right? So
of course. So these are, I think, the most difficult um ideas in there, for me, just when I read over them, was number 4, when I read the confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels, right? It's like,
And that's emigrants with an E. So we're talking
E,
about people leaving the
leaving
country,
the
not
place. So it's not
coming.
the immigrants part, it's the rebels, right? But this is returning to the true conflict that is being presupposed by this text and the revolutionary fervor that is surrounding this work, which is that, you know, we do not need to cede anything to reactionaries, right? Like, I think there is this natural conciliatory element to what is called the left now, because of years and years of domination by capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
by the bourgeoisie, and uh, because of that, and because of the success of certain pacifist movements, we can look to people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi, right, as successfully making changes towards betterment within the bourgeois system for people through pacifism. It has become, anathema to imagine that we might have to fight against the reactionary rebellion that follows a authentic revolution or a real revolution, let's say. But I think that's the mindset that we must start taking, that there hasn't been some magical pacification of the political realm in the 20th century, but rather we have largely lost in the 20th century, and therefore it becomes more difficult to imagine this sort of conflict.
Well, yeah, I mean, it becomes an almost what is that syndrome where you learn to love your hostages?
I just had it. Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome. Yeah, I'm like Scandinavia or something. But when Marx talks about, like all we have to lose is our chains, and this is what he's talking about, and there's a certain reactionary tendency where there's a certain Stockholm syndrome for the things that bind us. And
Yes.
I think if there's really any point to the Communist Manifesto, it is that the only way out of this is out of it. You know,
Yes.
the only way the proletarian revolution happens is by negating the bourgeois revolution, which means all of it has to go, because even the smallest amount that you try and keep, it kind of poisons the whole well in that sense,
Yes.
where it
So
becomes, well, what do you get rid of, what do you
yeah,
leave?
what do you keep?
And
What part of the
inevitably you're
market?
going to keep some kind of system of oppression that's
Yeah.
keeping the working class down, because that's how the system functions. it,
Well,
it only functions that way.
you see my sneakers behind me.
Hmm.
God damn, I would be sad if there were no there weren't like a range of really cool sneakers
The man loves his
in
kicks.
socialism. But, what are we really talking about? If everyone could live a better life, if everyone could have a standard of living that would improve things incredibly, what would come out of that? My assumption is something far more rich and meaningful than whatever it is I have right now. And so there's that speculative gap, that leap,
Hmm.
what William James would call a leap of faith, and he was talking about it in a religious context, but I think it's meaningful pragmatically to apply in a more practical political sense, that like there is this gap in speculation, and this is important to Marx when he talks about the materialism that defines the way that we are going to do things, is that we're going to have to look past what is known, what is familiar, to jump into this next phase, into this next epoch. Now, one thing I want to go back towards very quickly
Hmm.
are two categories that he sort of that outline the proletariat. On the one side, you have the petty bourgeoisie, right, which he defines as the like small business owner. This is something we talked about in the last episode. The worker who's gained enough money to feel some connection to the capitalist system, etc. Um, and their function as essentially conservative, right? And we can see this in like the affluent religious community, or the liberal elite of a city, but that isn't actually
Or like
part,
the salaried class, you know?
or
I
the
mean,
salary
it's
class,
like
yes, as the core.
they feel like, you know, in some ways, if you're offered a salary, it feels like you're finally escaping wage labor, but you're actually selling your wage wholesale. It's actually a
Yes,
worse deal. You know, and but they give you a bigger figure to, you know, juice the
make it
deal a
appear
little
like
bit.
it's not. Yeah.
Right.
And
And and their function, especially in Marx's view, is this very reactionary one where, um, you know, they kind of act as a interlocutor between the two classes at the to the benefit of the bourgeoisie,
yes,
and and also in the sense of, you know, it's the hope that you see all the time, right, in this country, where it's like people actively voting against or acting against their own class consciousness because, oh well maybe next week, maybe next year I will
yes.
too be rich.
And we also see it with the mass fetishization of billionaires and the people, I've recently, the UFC, its heavyweight champion left and
Hmm.
didn't take the big contract. And the amount of vitriol that I've seen against him while parroting the statements of its
Management.
parents company and management. This is a tendency of the petty bourgeoisie, a petty bourgeois mindset. Then on the other side of the proletariat is the Lumpenproletariat, which he has some strong words for, right? I think he calls them scum, but he's really talking about people who are not working. I'm sure alcoholics would come in this class. I think ironically, Marx was known as like someone who, when you came to his house, it was going to be a complete mess. He wouldn't know what to do when he was writing. So I find it fascinating that he kind of addresses this group, but they're ultimately the people that he sees as not being politically engageable, right? And
Yeah,
because of that,
I was just gonna say, I mean, they had to give him a deadline to write the Communist Manifesto
yeah,
because he was dragging his feet so much. They're like, listen, we need it by February. We're going to somebody else. And he's like, okay,
yeah,
I'll do it.
yeah. But ultimately, this is one of the places where I have the biggest conflict with Marx. I look to the Black Panthers as like one of the greatest indications of the possibility of motivating the lumpen proletariat,
Hmm.
right? Because and then also third world nationalism,
Hmm.
which where you can see anywhere from like Egypt in the 60s to the Vietnam War, and the Viet Cong, to various the
Zapatistas.
Zapatistas,
Hmm.
etc., that there are means of motivating these groups. And like I saw a recent study about the riots, about police brutality during COVID, and or during the pandemic lockdown. Um, and what it said was that majority of these people were not leftist, right? They were people who are directly affected by the like legitimate surrounding concerns. And so while I understand what he's saying, and I think there is some truth to it, I think that that's something that socialists have to engage, which is there is proletariat and lumpen proletariat, and how is it that we can best engage with these people who have abdicated politics? Because as we have in our country, 50% of people who do not vote, right, who do not see it as having any function. So this
Yeah,
is
in the
a
quote
furtive
unquote
ground.
free country of the world, the candidate, if you ran not voting as a candidate, would have won every election. I don't have the stat in front of me, but
Yeah.
since like 1960 or something.
Yes.
Um, and and yeah, and I think that's where the fertile ground is, but also where, you know, perhaps we can learn from and grow from Marx and his ideas, which are at this point fucking almost 200 years old. So,
Yes.
um, you know, I think it's important for us to look at this and study because it is so informative. But I also see people who get caught up in it, where it's like there wasn't, forget about the internet, there wasn't cars, right? There wasn't, I mean, there were rifles, there were muskets, but there weren't even guns really when he was
Yeah.
writing this. So a lot has changed, right? There
And
wasn't radio, television.
and I think as we get into capital, like questions about algorithms, about the way that value can be created wholesale out of a complete specter of scarcity, right? Like how these new financial mechanisms are the harbinger of a shift that Marx himself talked about, which was the point at which we are where production is no longer done by human beings,
Mhm.
right? So that's going to be something that we get to later. But in the third substantial section, he then gets into various forms of pre-existing socialism, right? So the first one he talks about is feudal socialism. And so for feudal socialism, this is essentially a sort of kind of egalitarian reform. And this is like, I think, directly uh, referencing the Orleanist success of the 1830 revolution, where there is this idea that we can resolve our problems from, as well as reforms in England in 1832, that we can resolve the problems of the proletariat through a feudal regime, right? And this at bottom, he says, is impossible. And I think it's pretty simple.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this section is important in the two sense that it's like you can't go backwards, because there's always this section of utopianism specifically, but socialism as well, where if only we can return to these like feudal modes of production or the guild system or something, and he rightly says the cat's out of the bag. I mean, maybe you can do that isolated somewhere in a small community or something, but globally, it's not going to happen. And his other big point is that it has to be a wholesale revolution. You can't do
Yes.
this by a series of reforms. And these are
And
the
the,
kind
and
of two political factions that he warns us against.
yes, and this and that your last point is continues throughout all of these definitions of what's going on in socialism up until the point that he writes this. So the second group he talks about is petty bourgeois socialism, right? Which in France, you have this conflict going on against Louis Philippe the First, and then the Orleanists turned against him. The followers of Auguste Thiers turn against him, and they start something what they called the banquet, right? So I think I'm forgetting the exact term for it, and maybe I'll remember it sometime now, but it's largely unimportant. Essentially, because the government was blocking the ability for people to politically organize, they had decided to make this pacifist attempt to go around that, have these banquets together, and through that they thought they could work towards what England had, a parliamentary system, a system that would help France, where they had incredible poverty, towns that were entirely destitute, 140,000 children on the street, right? And again, this is something that ultimately is looking to go backwards as a form of politics, as to some bourgeois form that has already shown itself to not be able to function, right? That it is intrinsically anti-revolutionary, and what it wishes to create is a very simple set of political relations.
Yeah. Well, and this is like, I think this is where you see the Hegelianism of Marx, right? Because he's essentially in this part, he's fighting against kind of the positivist outlook of like
Mhm.
Saint-Simon or these other like French sociologists. And, you know, he's seeking the negative form. And I think that's important because he, as he so eloquently points out in this manifesto, is that, you know, reforms will only reform itself to be what it already is because the system is based upon the
Yeah.
appropriation and exploitation of the proletariat in all its forms. And so that's what he's pushing against, you know.
Yeah. You entirely you fixed on what I had forgotten. And Saint Simon, you know, he talks about the Christian asceticism with a socialist twist, right? And there he's directly referencing Saint Simon, who was uh, French thinker of the 18 teens, heavily influenced by freedom in America, who saw that, you know, that politically we should move away from state control. He was heavily influenced by Adam Smith, and this is something we referenced earlier. And he saw in all of this writing great possibilities for freedom, and saw this as a grounds for socialism. And in this regard, when we historically think about socialism through the filter of Marx and then later the Russian Revolution, a lot of the details and nuances of how socialism was heterogeneous get lost.
Hmm.
But I think referencing Saint-Simon is extremely interesting. You know, he wrote this long text, Industry, and in Industry he makes these declarations, but the declarations are closer to what we would call left libertarianism than we would conventional socialism, though he would be considered a socialist. And then later in European development, we would have the left libertarian or libertarian socialist position. And Marx says that does not work, right? Because it ultimately brings us back to an untenable set of bourgeois relationships that just cannot survive. So the third form that he describes is German or true socialism. And, you know, he said, yeah. So in this regard, he's being a bit facetious, but there's multiple interesting points. So coming out of this bourgeois revolution in 1830, which puts Louis Philippe in the seat of power as the monarch of France, you have simultaneously many French socialists writing. Saint-Simon is one of them, right? And their ideas uh, are moved to Germany, right? They immigrate to Germany, and in this process, he says that, you know, they become they lose their meaning, their material context, because, you know, the French conditions, the French working conditions and political conditions do not transfer with the work. For instance, he says, here's a quote. For instance, beneath the French criticism of the economic functions of money, they wrote alienation of humanity. And beneath the French criticism of the bourgeois state, they wrote dethronement of the category of the general, and so forth. The introduction of these philosophical phrases at the back of the French historical criticisms they dubbed philosophy of action, true socialism, German science of socialism, German foundation of socialism, and so on, right? And so what he's getting at is, at the beginning, as the Germans are appropriating these French ideas of socialism and developing them, they are abstracting them, right? And they are not being treated in a concrete way. But what he does say is that as people have to get to the actual work of doing socialism, that something comes out of this, that something meaningful comes out of this, and that is a genuine critique of German society, right? That it creates some potential for proletarian transformation.
Yeah, and they, his aim, I mean, and he's also like working with a lot of German socialists. So
Absolutely.
obviously the aim is then to apply this to Germany, and but recognize that it is different, right? And I think this is like, if you're historically study communism or socialism or whatever, it's kind of the fascinating thing how it almost functioned in Germany, how it came into place in Russia, how it happened in Cuba or China or Vietnam, because they're all very different places with very different prevailing material conditions, right?
Yes.
And while this is the shortest part of the book, it's in some ways very interesting for this, because he's
Yes.
identifying that, okay, here we're using all these great ideas and look at all this cool stuff. But when it comes to Germany, it becomes, and it's almost a stab in the back of Feuerbach or something, where it's like, this is the end of German idealism and the beginning
Yes.
of a dialectical materialism.
Absolutely. And I think there's some direct reference to again Lassalle, who, influenced by David Ricardo, is argues for the iron law of wages, which we can see in like like the centrist, $1,000 a month, what do they call it? Whatever, the
UBI or
universal,
whatever, universal basic.
yeah, universal basic income or whatever, right? Like that, Ricardo saw that there needed to be some system that guaranteed living value to people, but he did so in an artificial way. And this is something that Lassalle believed in intensely, and which was an element of what was going on in Germany. Similarly, Lassalle was extremely influenced by Fichte, and Fichte's address to the German people, I believe it's called. And in that address, what Fichte is, centering upon is the idea, and this is what really came of the German Revolution, was its one major success, and that was to unite people around a common culture, a common language, right, between all of these states and Prussia and Vienna and in all these German states in Western Poland, and that statism is at odds with what Marx is ultimately envisioning. So again, there is this work that's being done, and the fact that you must engage with the workers of a state towards betterment. But ultimately, as we see in Capital, it does not end there, because the basic bourgeois assumptions of thinkers like Ricardo on Lassalle, their influence on his influence on Lassalle, or Smith's on Saint-Simon, undermine the actual socialist concepts that are going to be materially realized in the conflict for society between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, Marx is, in a lot of ways, he's trying to preach to his kind, because he believes that the actual revolution will come from the boots on the ground, and always argued against this like slow, long-term education of the proletariat, because they had nothing to learn. They or rather they need not learn anything, because it's
They
their
don't.
experience that is informing this whole process.
Yeah. And in this regard, that kind of petty bourgeois revolution, an element he doesn't talk about as much, but he may mention some elsewhere, but like some of these revolutions, the in the German Revolution, like some moments of it, and I'm not sure if it's in Dresden or where, but like, you have students jumping up to, lead this, and you'll see this a ton in the multiple Russian revolutions, particularly of 1905, where ideas are at the front of why people are acting. But the proletariat is steeped in these conditions and has an internal motivation towards that, which has been sucked of them, like a vampire, by capitalism in the present. And so, like, bringing these to light, understanding why they aren't coming to light, understanding the kind of change conditions and what it is that will motivate people to action, right,
Mm.
are important things for leftists to think about. Ultimately, these three elements that he's talking about all come together as their A, B, and C of this first section on forms of socialism. And this true form of socialism for the Germans is still using these naturalized, and I would say he's clearly saying influenced by the idealists, these major concepts of these total ideal concepts that are for him a philosophical fantasy, right?
Mm.
And that there
Impediment
is,
almost.
yeah, an impediment, and there's this brutally destructive character, as he describes it, of socialism in action that destroys all eternal truths, right? Like the eternal truth of justice or whatever. And so, like, when you run against, say, when Derrida later on in his life was trying to move away from the sense that his work was relativist, he comes to this sort of ontological or post-ontological conclusion that justice is, what centers the work of deconstruction and of his philosophy. Like, those bourgeois tendencies, they do not help us. They are obfuscating, right? And because justice isn't something that you can hold on to, right? You can put into action the concept of justice when you see injustice. And this reminds me of an Adorno quote where he says, essentially, that we have to move past positive freedom. The only freedom is found in responding to unfreedom. He says this in Negative Dialectics, and this is what Marx is sort of outlining, that we are in this constant critical relationship with reality, with the reality of proletarian life, and that will produce the ideas. It's not that the ideas are going to precede it, right? He is outlining this idea of communism, but it's something that's coming out of a revolution, and that will change when he writes a text later, right?
In fact, that the ideas are the very things that hold us back. Um, you know, that's kind of his whole mantra, right? Is these destruction of these universal truths, and that they must be destroyed, and from the ashes something new can be made. And it's only until we can actually destroy those that we get to move forward. Until we do, we're caught in this kind of capitalist limbo. Um, and and not that we want to end the episode in this very like unsteady ground, but I think that's where we have to, and that's where Marx is writing from. That's where we find ourselves today. While there is a lot of hope, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's the uncertainty that's actually our ally.